In the rolling South Downs of Sussex, you may not expect to come across a monument to soldiers from the Indian subcontinent. But here, in this most English of landscapes, stands a memorial that honours Indian dead of the First World War. Known as the Chattri, it marks a spot where 53 Hindu and Sikh soldiers were cremated according to their religious beliefs. To understand why, you need to turn your gaze to nearby Brighton. Today, the town's Royal Pavilion, built as a seaside palace for George IV, is a hugely popular tourist attraction. But 100 years ago, it played host to different visitors.
In the early part of the First World War, Indian soldiers made up a large part of the British Expeditionary Force on the Western Front in France and Flanders. And as casualties mounted up, those troops, the sick and wounded troops, needed to be treated somewhere. And Brighton was chosen as the site for 3 hospitals, one of which was the Royal Pavilion, where those men would be treated. And over the course of a little over a year, over 12,000 Indian soldiers passed through the town of Brighton. Brighton was chosen because the British wanted a site actually in England, because they felt that only the British really understood these Indian men, and they weren't very comfortable with them being cared for in France, where they felt that local authorities might not understand their cultural needs. But there were so many Indian soldiers who expected to pass through these hospitals that they had to find somewhere on the south coast of England that was large enough to support that. The significance that was used by the British a lot more was not so much the Indian look of the building, because you also have to remember that the men who served in the Indian Army were largely rural men who probably had never even seen a large building like this in India. But it was also where the British did use the sort of connotations of the pavilion very much were its royal associations. Now, even though this building had actually been purchased by the town from Queen Victoria back in 1850, the British very much played on its associations as a royal palace, and the men were led to believe that King George V had personally given up his palace for their use.
Over 1.5 million Indian soldiers served in the First World War, and over 74,000 of them lost their lives. The British Indian Army was the largest volunteer force in the world and suffered significant casualties on the Western Front. But the hospital in Brighton was designed to care for them in many ways.
One of the really interesting aspects of the hospitals in Brighton, including the Royal Pavilion, were the huge measures and care given to looking after the Indian men's cultural and religious needs. And one of those is their dietary needs. So 9 different kitchens were set up in the grounds so that food could be cooked by co-religionists and fellow caste members. There's also a fragment we have in the gallery in the Royal Pavilion that shows a diet sheet that the British actually used, so that because the wards were mixed and you might often have a Hindu in bed next to a Muslim, they had a very complicated system by which they could register every patient in every bed and actually have a record of what type of food had to go to that individual man. There was even a micro-industry set up around Brighton to support the hospital, so we know of one very enterprising butcher named Mr. Tate in nearby St James's Street, who created a slaughterhouse in his backyard that dealt with both halal and jatka slaughter, specifically for Muslim and Hindu and Sikh men, so they could actually have cattle slaughtered according to their preferred methods. I think most poignantly where space was given for religious expression was for those men who unfortunately died in the Brighton hospitals. For Hindus and Sikhs who are not buried but traditionally cremated, an open-air cremation site known as a ghat was created on the South Downs, and there Hindus and Sikhs were cremated, which itself is extraordinary because open-air cremations were, and I believe still are, technically illegal, but such was the need for this hospital to actually honour those religious beliefs that dispensation was granted for open-air cremations to take place there.
The Chattri was built on the precise location where the bodies of the soldiers were cremated. Afterwards, their ashes were scattered in the sea in accordance with their funeral rites. The memorial, designed by a young Indian architect, E.C. Henriques, was unveiled by the Prince of Wales in 1921, and now, every year, a service is held to remember the 53 and all the soldiers from the Indian subcontinent. The event is attended by the Indian High Commissioner and other dignitaries, as well as members of the Hindu and Sikh community from across the country.
They fought bravely in France, in Flanders, in Mesopotamia, in Palestine, in Egypt, in East Africa, in Gallipoli. I'm very happy that we every year honor the memory of those who died here and in this area on this wonderful and beautiful hill with a lovely view, but it's indeed a very solemn and poignant moment.
Many are coming for the first time and learning of their ancestors' service and contribution.
I found it really moving, and it's more beautiful than I thought it was. And I think it's the sharing a history that we never knew and how powerful we become through education to teach others that don't have the chance to come to Brighton.
Kiran Sahota, a researcher specialising in Indian military history, has brought a group of young students from Birmingham for their first visit.
This has been a real treat and an education for them, because here not only do they get to ask questions about what it's like to be Sikh and serving in the British Armed Forces today, but also questions about the Chattri and how they can go back home and educate their families and friends.
It's imperative that young people across the country, in fact, people of all ages, young or old, really get to understand where we come from, what our heritage is, and the shared values that we've had with Empire troops and their contribution. The Chattri really brings that home. Here in Brighton Hove, the community gets together, irrespective of their background, ethnicity, race or gender. We get together collectively to mark the passing of those 53 individuals who gave up their lives to ensure our freedoms that we enjoy today.
After India and Pakistan gained their independence in 1947, the sacrifices of Indian soldiers serving in an imperial army have often been forgotten. The 53 soldiers memorialised here never returned home to their country, to their villages, to their families, but their names will be forever remembered in this peaceful setting amongst the chalky hills, in this corner of a foreign field.